Standing on the promises of Christ my King, through eternal ages let His praises ring. Glory in the highest I will shout and sing, standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises I cannot fall. Bless me every moment to the Spirit's call. Resting in my Savior as my all and all. Standing on the promises of God. Standing on the promises of God, my Savior. I'm standing on the promises of God. Again, we are very, very thankful that you are here. If you have just arrived and have not registered, please do so. That will help us next year have your correct address and updates and that type of thing. And please try to write that as best you can so that we can read it. And we'll do our best to get you an invitation and a schedule next year. So please do your best to register for us. We do have the CDs available. We've mentioned that. You can let somebody know at either one of the tables, or just simply write it down on a business card or whatever and leave it on the tables for us, and we'll have that. Along that line, everything that we're doing will be up on YouTube. Just go to Dayton Church of Christ. You should be able to find that. And someone suggested that if you want to subscribe to our YouTube page, then it'll bring everything up. I hope I'm saying that right. I know there's a button that you push to turn that computer on, and if it don't come on when I push that button, I call for help. So that's about as good as I can do. In fact, all of our Sunday morning, our Bible class, our sermons on Sunday are on YouTube. So if you have an interest in that, then it is there. Our speaker at this hour is Will Hanstein. Will grew up in western Colorado, received a bachelor and master's degree from Freed-Hardeman. He's preached in Tennessee, Texas, as well as Colorado. He served as the Dean of Graduate Studies at Bear Valley for 11 years. Since June of last year, he's been director of the Southeast Institute of Biblical Studies, formerly the East Tennessee School of Preaching up at Carnes. He's married to the former Jenny Smith. They have 2 children, Sam and Bailey. And we're glad to have Will over here in God's country, moved across the river. We're glad that he is here. He's doing an excellent job up at the school. Probably for many of us, maybe most of us, this is the first time that we have had the opportunity of hearing him speak. And that was at least one of the reasons that we invited him to be with us this morning. And we look forward to the lesson that he has prepared for us. At this time, Brother Bob Oliver is going to come and lead us in prayer. And after that prayer, then Will speak to us.
Shall we pray together? Our most holy Father, what a joy it is to be able to be in thy presence this day. We pray, our Father, that we will be workers in thy vineyard. We will do the things to bring thee praise and glory and honor. We're thankful, our Father, for this congregation and this lectureship that they share with us each year. We pray much good will come from their efforts. We're thankful for our speakers. And our hearts also pray for Brother Tom Holland, our beloved mentor and preacher and friend. Watch over each of us. Help us to do thy will. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Good morning, brethren. It's good to see you. And I want to apologize. About a month and a half or so ago, I got a really bad cold, and this cough just kind of hangs on. And every so often I'll get into this coughing spell. And so I have a cough drop in my mouth, and I'm hoping it'll last a little while. But normally I wouldn't preach with gum or anything like that in my mouth, in part because I was always taught that you just don't do that, that's poor form and that's rude. But also there's always the chance that I'll get to speaking and that cough drop or whatever will launch out that direction. And so if it does, if you'll just catch it and hand it back to me, I'd appreciate it, because I'd like it to make it through this lesson. I appreciate so much the invitation to speak here, and I'm very honored by it. And I appreciate so much all you've done for the school up at Southeast ever since 1971 when it started, from what I've been told. So you've been with us for a long time, and it's very much appreciated by us, and thank you very much. And I also have to say it's good to be here with Brother Dearman and Brother Hires. When I first got the invitation to speak, I looked at who was going to be on the program, and I wondered if they had asked the wrong guy, because when you look at least at the time, it was Brother Holland and Brother Hires and then me, and it was one of those things, which one of these doesn't belong? Those two men, and then Brother Dearman as Brother Holland's substitute, have been men that I've read and heard my whole life, and they don't know it, but they have been mentors to me from afar, and I've benefited so greatly from their wisdom, and I don't feel like I am anywhere close to the caliber that they are, but I do appreciate the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here. If you'd please turn to Hebrews chapter 6. We're going to be looking at verses 13 through 20 for just a few minutes anyway. When we talk about hope as an anchor of the soul, we're talking about something that's firm and something that doesn't move. When we use that English word hope, though, it can convey a variety of nuances. 4 o'clock today, the Tennessee Volunteers are playing Tennessee Tech. Well, are the Vols going to win? Somebody may say, well, I hope so. But then we might get a little more serious with our usage of hope when we say, well, is such and such a candidate going to win the election this coming Tuesday? Somebody said, well, I hope so. But then we might get a little more serious when we're at the doctor and he's showing us some test results that don't look very good, or our loved ones some test results that don't look very good, and we may ask the doctor, am I going to live? He may say, well, I hope so. We're going to do all we can. And then it gets even more serious, even though sometimes we may not treat it as serious. But somebody may ask us, are you going to go to heaven? Are you saved? Well, I hope so. See, that's what we're dealing with this morning, at least for this hour. What's our hope? Is it just this kind of, well, I hope so? You see, God's made a promise to us. He's promised that He would save us. If you look in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 9, The writer of Hebrews says, though we speak in this way, yet in your case, beloved, we feel sure of better things, things that belong to salvation. And then skipping down to verse 12, so that you may not be sluggish, but imitators of those who through faith and patience inherit the promises. The promise is salvation. And so we hope in something that we don't have. Right now, at least in the ultimate. So how can we be sure? Do we have this, well, I hope so, kind of a hope? Or do we have a hope that the Bible talks about? See, when the Bible uses the term hope, it doesn't mean something that we really desire to happen, but there's this implication of uncertainty about it, whether it will be fulfilled. That's not the way the Bible defines hope. The way the Bible defines hope is something that will happen. You can take it to the bank. You can be sure of it. Even though it hasn't happened yet, it's so sure it's as if it already has. And so when we look at Hebrews 6 and verse 13 and following, there the writer of Hebrews says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of the promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope set before us. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, in which enters the presence behind the veil, where the forerunner has entered for us, even Jesus, having become high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Brethren, we have this promise from God. But what makes us think God's going to keep that promise? No. I don't know you. I mean, I may have met you just now, but we don't know each other. And so if you make a promise to me or I make a promise to you, how can you trust or have confidence that I'm going to keep it? Well, the writer of Hebrews tells us three ways that we can have. Three actions of God, if you will, or I should say three things when we look at God that show us that God's going to keep his promise. Show us that our hope is an anchor of the soul, that it's firm and it's steadfast. When you look at verses 13 through 15, for instance, the writer of Hebrews says you can have hope because of God's actions. Look at what God has done in the past. God has shown that when he makes a promise, he keeps it. Period. In verse 13 it says, when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. What is the writer talking about here? Well, he's talking about a promise that God restated to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. And if we back up about 25 plus years before that, when Abraham is 75 years old, he's living in the land of Haran, and God says, pack up your belongings, and I'm going to take you to a land that I will show you. And he says, there I will make of you a great nation, and through you, or your descendants, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Well, Abraham's 75 years old, and he packs up his bags in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3, and he goes to the land of Canaan. And then if we fast forward about 24 years, Abraham's 99. God hasn't done anything yet, really, to fulfill that promise. Abraham still doesn't have a child of promise. He still doesn't have all these descendants. All the nations of the earth still haven't been blessed. It's been 24 years of hard living and obeying God. Yet Abraham still doesn't have that promise fulfilled. so God in Genesis chapter 17, verses 1 through 21, says, all right, Abraham, in a year, you and Sarah are going to have a son, Isaac. And then he gives him the covenant of circumcision and all those kinds of things. And then a year later, when Abraham is 100 years old, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 1 through 7, Isaac was born. And that begins the fulfillment of God's promise to him. But notice, it was 25 years until the fulfillment began. And then a few years go down the road, and then in Genesis 22, verses 1 and 2, what does God tell Abraham? Remember that son that I promised you, that through him all the nations of the earth would be blessed? Well, I want you to take that son and go sacrifice him. What did Abraham do? It says in Genesis 22 and verse 3 that he rose early in the morning. Couldn't have been easy for Abraham to obey God. If God told me to do that with my son, it would be a difficult decision for me to make. But Abraham, he didn't sleep in that morning. He didn't drag his feet. He rose up early in the morning and he took his son. He went to sacrifice him. Now we find in Hebrews chapter 11 that Abraham's mindset was, well, God told me he would do this. God promised me he would do this. I don't know how. I don't know how he's going to do this, but Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that Abraham just figured that God would raise his son back from the dead. But Abraham didn't know. But he trusted God, and he persevered. He had faith and patience, as verse 12 of Hebrews chapter 6 says. But notice, Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 15 says that Abraham obtained the promise. What is this promise? You see, when Abraham stretched his son out on the altar and raised the knife to kill him, the angel of the Lord stayed his hand. And if you look in Genesis chapter 22, here's the promise that the writer of Hebrews is referring to. He says in Genesis chapter 22, in verse 16, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you. And I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. But notice verse 16. By myself I have sworn. That's the promise. That's the promise that the writer of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 6 is referring to. God made a promise to Abraham. Now, it wasn't fulfilled 5 minutes later. It wasn't fulfilled 5 years later. In fact, its final fulfillment wouldn't come for 2,000 years in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, who was a descendant of Abraham. See, Hebrews 6 and verse 15 says he obtained the promise, but Hebrews 11 and verse 13 says that he died without receiving the things promised. And both of those are true. See, Isaac was born. That was the beginning of the fulfillment. But Abraham didn't live to see his descendants become a great nation. He didn't live to see, at least physically on this earth, the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. But you see, through faith, trust in God, and patience, Abraham believed, and God kept his promise. When it was the right time to keep that promise at every stage, God kept it. Abraham continued for those 25 plus years hoping in God. Because to Abraham, if God promised it, it was as good as done. You know, brethren, God will fulfill His promise to us at the right time too. He's made a great promise to us. We just read in Hebrews chapter 6, verses 9 and 12, that promise is salvation. He's promised us salvation. And yet we haven't realized that, at least fully. Obviously we're saved now if we've obeyed Him in the waters of baptism, and if we're faithful, we're saved right now. But as lovely as this part of Tennessee is, and even though it's called God's country, and with good reason, it's not heaven. It's not heaven. And so we haven't fully realized that promise of God. So what do we have to do? We have to have faith that God will keep it. And we have to persevere even when we want to give up, just like Abraham. See, we can have confidence because we can look in the past and see every single promise God has made, He's kept. Every single one. You know, when I was a boy, my dad would say, I'll be there at thus and such a time to pick you up from school, or I'll be there at thus and such a time to pick you up at practice. And you know what? Sometimes he wouldn't get there on time. You know, now sometimes it was his fault, but sometimes it wasn't his fault. You know, sometimes he fully intended to do it, but he just couldn't get there. Maybe the traffic was bad or whatever the reason was, but it was out of his control. Not so with God. If God makes the promise, there's no force that will keep Him from keeping that promise. But see, our problem, brethren, is sometimes it's hard to be a Christian. And I'm not saying it's hard to want to be a Christian. But sometimes it's hard to do the things that God wants us to do. Sometimes life just really affects us. These Jewish Christians that the writer of Hebrews is writing to, when they first became Christians, they were on fire. They were zealous. Hebrews 10, verses 32 and 33. They endured a great persecution by being imprisoned or having their property seized right after they became Christians, and they endured it well. But all the pressure was wearing them down, and they were tired, and they were discouraged. They had been disowned by their families, the Roman government, because they were Jews who had become Christians. The Roman government was no friend to Christianity, and they were feeling pressure there. And so they were flirting with going back to Judaism because they were tired. And it was easier. And some of them were wavering about whether or not God would actually keep His promise, whether they'd actually make it. And the writer of Hebrews is telling them, don't give up. Don't give up. Look at what God did. God will keep His word, just like He did with Abraham. And in our day and age, brethren, sometimes it's hard to be a Christian. It's hard to be ridiculed because all you want to do is what God says. It's hard to be called a homophobe when you don't hate anybody. You just want people to go to heaven. And you just want to do what God says. And then here are people ridiculing you and trying to make your life more difficult. I don't know if you remember, but a number of years ago there was a bakery in the Denver area that was sued because they refused to bake a wedding cake for a homosexual couple. Just a couple years prior to that, my wife and I had our rehearsal dinner at that same bakery. So that hit a little close to home for us. My parents' house in Denver at the time was just maybe a quarter of a mile away. It's hard to be a Christian. Sometimes the pressures of life hit you and you wonder, does God even care about me? You get some bad news at the doctor. You have maybe some family members that make some poor choices or lose your job or have trouble paying the bills or whatever the case may be. Is God going to keep His promise to me? Is it worth it, one might say? Maybe it's just tiresome to obey all those commands, as some might look at it. Maybe we might be tempted to round off the edges because after all, we'd have more friends that way. We'd have better relationships at work, maybe even better relationships at home. better relationships with our family, or what have you. But God would tell us, don't give up. See, we have a hope that's anchored. It's an anchor of the soul. And we can look at a God who every single time has kept his promises. Every single time. He's reliable, to say the least. He's dependable, to say the least. This isn't an I hope so kind of hope. It's going to happen. It's going to happen kind of hope. We can have a hope that's an anchor of the soul because we look at God's actions. But secondly, we can have a hope that's an anchor of the soul because we have God's assurance. Look at verses 16 through 18 with me. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. You know, brethren, what he's talking about here is God promised Abraham something, and then he swore an oath to Abraham that he would fulfill that promise. Now that makes sense to us. If I were to, usually if somebody's selling a house and you want to buy that house, what do you have to do? You can't just go and knock on the door and say, I want to buy your house and I've got all the money, so let's just meet down at the bank at some time and just trust me that I'll have it all together. Well, they want something in addition to your promise. They want what essentially is an oath. They want you to sign some official or some legal documents saying, yes, I pledge to buy your home, and this is the purchase price that I will pay for that home, and this is the amount of earnest money that I will put down for your home, and this is the schedule of all the events that have to take place between now and the closing date and all that. See, they don't want just your promise. They want what essentially is akin to an oath. And generally speaking, when we make an oath, we have to swear by somebody greater than ourselves to guarantee that. In other words, I don't know if they still do this on the witness stand. I guess Brother Hires could tell us, but at least in the movies, they would put their left hand on the Bible and they would raise their right hand in the courtroom, and do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Well, if the guy said, well, I'm not going to swear by God, but I'll swear by Mickey Mouse. Well, that's just not good enough. Or I'll swear by my cousin. Well, it's just not good enough. You have to swear by somebody greater, and in our case, God. Well, notice what God did. When God stayed the hand of Abraham from sacrificing his son in Genesis chapter 22, he said in verse 16, he repeated the promise, but he swore an oath that he would keep that promise. And since he couldn't swear by anyone greater because there's no one greater than God, all he could do was swear by himself. And so the writer of Hebrews says that these two unchangeable or immutable things show us that God will keep his promise. What are the two unchangeable things? He made a promise, and then he swore an oath that he'd keep that promise. Now think about that, brethren. God's shown that he always keeps his promises. Does he need to swear an oath that he'll do it? Of course not. He's God. In fact, the writer of Hebrews reminds us that it's impossible for God to lie. He has no need to lie. In fact, Numbers 23 and verse 19 says, God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said it? Will he not do it? Or has he spoken and will he not fulfill it? God says it. It's going to happen. He's not going to lie. He never has and he never will. So why did he swear an oath then on top of the promise that he made? Well, the writer of Hebrews in verse 17 says, "So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose." The writer of Hebrews says he didn't swear that oath because he needed to convince Abraham. It was something God did to convince the heirs of the promise, and that's you and me. If you look in Galatians 3 and verse 29, Paul says that if you're Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. God did it looking forward to all those people that would believe in Jesus. You see, God didn't just say, you can have hope because you can look back on the fact that I have kept every promise I've made. He did do that, but that's not all he did. Because he wanted us to feel extra encouragement or extra consolation, as the New King James says. He did something extra. He made the promise, and then he swore an oath that he would keep it, because he wanted us to feel extra secure. You know, brethren, as the writer of Hebrews says, he says, we who have need, or we who have fled for refuge, might have strong encouragement. Verse 18. You know, brethren, as sinful men and women, we need refuge, don't we? We need refuge, and the only place to find it is in God. The only thing we can hold on to is that hope in the promise that God has made to us. I can't hold on to anything in this life. I'm 41 years old. Things that seem to be flying by me 1,000 miles an hour, and I hear it gets worse as you get older. I have an 8-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl, and it seems just like yesterday that they were just a little bitty. You know, I've lived in Tennessee, Texas, and Colorado, and other places in my life. Just things change. There's nothing firm and static, nothing immutable about this world. All I have to hold on to is the hope that God gives me in that promise that one day he's going to take me to heaven. But notice, it's immovable. It's immutable. I once thought that when I was playing hockey, I once thought that I could move a man who weighed 100 more pounds than me so I could get a shot off on a goal when I was growing up in Colorado. And so when I went to hit him, I found out that he did move. And I did. And I got hurt as a result and had to spend a couple weeks out of practice. Promises of God, they don't move, brethren. You can grab onto them and they're not going anywhere. And if you're holding on to it, you won't go anywhere either. See, we can have this hope as an anchor of the soul because of God's actions. And we can have this hope as an anchor of the soul because of God's assurance. But thirdly, we can have this hope as an anchor of the soul because of God's access. Notice with me verses 19 and 20. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus is gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. What does this mean, brethren? It means we have access to God, and ultimately in its fulfillment we'll have the greatest access to God that anybody, any human being has ever had. You see, this hope that we have as an anchor, what's the purpose of an anchor? The purpose of an anchor is to keep a ship in one spot. The captain drops his anchor so that the wind and the waves and whatever forces that might buffet that boat don't move it away from where he wants it to stay. And our hope, through faith and perseverance, is an anchor. An anchor that doesn't move us away from where we need to be to keep our salvation. But notice where this anchor has been dropped. The writer of Hebrews says it's been dropped behind the veil. What does that mean? Well, when these Jewish Christians would have read that, it would have blown their mind. so to speak. You see, that veil refers to the veil that separated the holy place from the most holy place inside the temple. The most holy place, which was behind the veil, that's the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, where the very presence of God was said to dwell. And you didn't go in there. If you were a Jew, you didn't go in there. Even if you were a priest, you didn't go in there. You might, as a priest, get to go into the holy place, but you didn't go in the most holy place. There was one person who could go in the most holy place. That was the high priest. And he could only go in once a year. And he would go in, he would do what he was supposed to do, and then he would come back out, and he would not go back in again for a whole year. But notice where our anchor is. Our anchor is behind that veil, in the very presence of God. In other words, our anchor is heaven. That's where our hope is fixed. That's where we're going if we don't lose this hope. But notice what else the writer of Hebrews says about it. He says where our forerunner Jesus has gone. Jesus is there with God right now too. He's behind the veil. But what's the significance of that? Well, he's the forerunner. In other words, if he's the one that goes first, and we're going to follow after. To the Jewish Christians reading this, they would have never even thought that that was possible. Why? Because when the high priest went into the Holy of Holies once a year, who got to follow him? Nobody. Nobody got to follow him. In fact, you didn't even get to go into the temple building itself unless you were a Levitical priest. The vast majority of the Jews had to stand outside, and so they would see the high priest go into the temple itself, and they would see him come back out, but they had no clue what was going, or they never got to see, I should say, what was going on inside that building, and no one got to see what went on inside the most holy place. The Bible's telling these Jewish Christians the day will come if you hold fast your faith and your perseverance, chapter or verse 12. The day will come when you go behind that veil too, into the very presence of God, and you stay. You don't have to come back out. Imagine how wonderful that would have been for those Jewish Christians to consider with all that they had been through. Brethren, imagine how wonderful that'll be for us with all we sometimes go through. I'm 41 years old, and most people would look at my life and they would say I haven't had a hard life, and they would be right. But I've still had my struggles, and I've still had my trials. I've still had my worries and my temptations and my sins and all those kinds of things that every person in this room has had to deal with if they're of any age whatsoever. And sometimes it's hard to be a Christian. This is hard. You know, there's a lot of places in this world that I don't have access to. I'd love to go to the White House, go into the Oval Office and sit down and tell the president what I think he should do. But you know what? I don't have access. I probably would maybe get 1 foot on the lawn of the White House before I was tackled or maybe even shot. I don't know what they would do to me, but they would let me know in no uncertain terms that I don't have the right to be there. I wouldn't even make it to the front door to knock. See, there's lots of places that I don't have it. I could try to go to the UT locker room and get some autographs this afternoon, I suppose, if I wanted to try. But they would let me know in no uncertain terms that I don't have access. But as powerful as our president is, most powerful man in the world probably, the day will come when I have access to the very throne room of the most powerful being ever to exist and ever will exist, God himself. If I just remain faithful and persevere brethren, we can have confidence in God. Our hope is not just an empty hand. Our hope is anchored in something firm and steadfast. You may have heard this before, but Winston Churchill, shortly after World War II ended, was giving a commencement address at the Harrow School, and in reference to what the folks in attendance had just been through with the bombing of London and all the sacrifice in World War II, Winston Churchill said, at least in part, never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honor and good sense. Never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. In our lives, sometimes we want to give in. In our lives, it looks at times like we just can't make it. It looks like there's an overwhelming force that's arrayed against us. We can't give in, because we have a hope that is an anchor of the soul, sure and steadfast. If we, like Abraham, through faith and perseverance, keep on keeping on, then one day we'll realize that hope. And we know we will, brethren. It's not a hope so. We know so because God's actions. He's kept every promise He's ever made, and He shows that in Abraham. Because of God's assurance. He goes the extra mile, so to speak, in making sure that we understand how seriously He takes the promise He made to us. He not only made the promise, but He swore with an oath He'd keep the promise, which is above and beyond anything God should ever be expected to do. And thirdly, we have this certain hope because of God's access. We're not going to have to stand around outside when we're in heaven, so to speak. We're going to be behind the veil, in the very presence of God and His Son Jesus. This hope we have as an anchor of the soul. Whatever you do, brethren, whatever hits you in life, don't you dare give up that hope. Don't you dare. Thank you.
You know, when you look at your speakers and who you're inviting, and a lot of things go into that process if you've ever done it, but to invite someone that you've met and you know, but I had never had the opportunity to hear Will speak, you're curious, but there's a little bit of fear back there too. Didn't he do an excellent job? He did an excellent job, and now that you've had an opportunity to hear him, here's someone that you may very well want to put on your schedule as well. Will, thank you. You know, probably 2-3 weeks ago, I had two people within just a short time of each other ask me if the lecture program was going to deal with the election and politics. And I thought, well, hadn't even thought about that. But then afterwards I thought, well, it is hope. Because regardless of whether we get, well, we will get one of these characters, aren't you glad that they will not be in charge? Almighty God is in charge. And if you look down through time, we can see that powers have come and those powers have gone. God is in control. There is hope. And truly it is an anchor. And Will, thank you. The job well done. We're going to take about 14-15 minute break. We'll be back. Brother Hires will be our next speaker. You're dismissed.